My parents stood at the center of their 30th anniversary party and called me their greatest mistake. The chandelier light trembled against the champagne glasses as my father said it calmly, almost proudly. He spoke about legacy, discipline, reputation. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Some children choose paths that embarrass the family." My mother added that at least they had learned to accept disappointment with grace. There was laughter. Not loud. Just enough. My 6-year-old son tightened his hand around mine. I could feel the warmth of his palm turning damp. He didn't understand the words. He understood the room. I stayed seated, my back straight, my face still. I remember counting my breath so I wouldn't shake. And then a chair scraped across marble. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories like this. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means more than you know. Now let me take you back to the moment the room changed. The chair scraping across marble that was the sound that split the air. But to understand why I didn't stand up first, you have to understand who I had been in that room long before that night. I was 29, living in a narrow rental house on the edge of Charlotte, the kind of place with thin walls and a mailbox that leaned slightly forward like it was tired. The paint on the porch peeled in small curls. The heater made a knocking sound every winter. It was ours, though. Owen's drawings were taped along the hallway. His shoes were always kicked off beside the door. I worked night shifts in the emergency department downtown. Trauma tech. 12 hours under fluorescent light. Blood under my nails. The smell of antiseptic that never fully left my skin. I came home most mornings just before sunrise. Owen would still be asleep, one arm flung across his pillow, breathing slow and even. I would stand in his doorway for a moment, watching the quiet rise and fall of his back, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones, only after I knew he was safe. My father used to say I had wasted my potential. He said it without anger, which somehow made it worse. He wanted law school. He wanted a daughter in tailored suits, arguing in courtrooms, carrying the family name into rooms that mattered. Instead, I wore scrubs and drove a car with a cracked side mirror. You could have been something, he told me once. I never asked him what he thought I was. My mother had her own way of erasing things. She had never once held Owen in front of other people. Not at church. Not at family gatherings. If he reached for her, she would smooth his hair briefly, then step back, as if she had touched something fragile that might break under scrutiny. When I told them I was pregnant at 23, my father stared at the kitchen counter for a long time. My mother asked one question: "Can this be handled?" That was the word she used. Handled. They said I was too young, that it would ruin everything I had worked toward, that the father disappearing 5 months in was proof enough of what my life would look like if I kept the baby. They said I would spend the rest of my life trying to climb out of a hole I had dug myself. I remember the weight of those words. Not loud, just heavy. I kept him anyway. They didn't forgive me for that. For years I told myself that their silence was temporary, that one day they would soften. That time would make Owen less of an embarrassment and more of a grandson. When the invitation to their anniversary party arrived in Boston gold, I let myself believe something had shifted. Maybe this was the night they would introduce him properly. Maybe this was the night my father would say his name. I arrived early enough to see the seating chart being adjusted near the entrance. Whiteboard, neat rows, last names in careful script. I looked for mine. Mitchell. I found it at the bottom. Not under family. Not near the front. My name was listed beside catering staff and event assistant's table designation, handwritten in smaller ink. A note beneath it: service access corridor. For a moment I thought it was a mistake. I stood there longer than I should have, tracing the letters with my eyes. My last name had always meant something in that family. That night it meant proximity to the kitchen door. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask anyone to change it. I just took Owen's hand and walked inside, already knowing exactly what role I had been assigned. I had already accepted the corridor before I stepped fully into the ballroom. The dress I wore that night had been marked down twice. I remember turning the price tag over in the store, calculating what groceries I would delay to afford it. It was navy simple long sleeves, nothing that would draw attention. I didn't want to ask anyone for help. I didn't want to owe anyone proof that I belonged there. Owen wore a small charcoal suit I had pieced together from a secondhand shop near our house. The sleeves were a little short until I let the hem down. I pressed it myself on the kitchen counter, steam rising in thin curls. When he stood in front of me before we left, shoes polished, hair combed flat, he looked solemn in a way 6-year-olds shouldn't have to look. The ballroom was brighter than I expected. Crystal chandeliers spilled light over white linen and polished silverware. A live jazz band played near the far wall, upright bass, vibrating softly against the floor. Waiters moved in smooth arcs, balancing trays of champagne. It was the kind of room my father liked. Controlled, impressive, expensive without being loud. He stood near the front table, shoulders squared, shaking hands with men in tailored suits. I watched him from across the room as he leaned in to laugh at something one of them said. His smile was precise, practiced. He saw me. His eyes passed over mine without stopping. I felt it physically, that absence, like air shifting. Owen squeezed my hand. That's Grandpa, he whispered as if confirming it for himself. Yes, I said. My mother moved between tables with the same polished energy. She touched arms lightly, nodded at compliments, adjusted place cards. When someone asked about me, I could tell by the tilt of their head in my direction. She gave a small smile. That's our daughter, she said. She's chosen a more free-spirited path. Free-spirited. It sounded almost flattering until you heard the pause before it. No one asked a second question. We made our way to the back of the room. The service doors swung open and closed beside our table, releasing bursts of heat and the smell of roasted meat. Staff brushed past us carrying trays. I could hear kitchen orders being called through the crack in the door. Table designation, service access. Owen climbed carefully into his chair. His shoes didn't quite reach the floor. He watched the front of the room where my parents stood beneath the chandeliers. Why don't they tell people I'm their grandson? He asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I adjusted his napkin instead, smoothed it over his lap. They're busy, I said finally. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Children understand more than we want them to. I kept my gaze low for most of the evening. It's easier that way. If you don't search faces, you don't have to see what's reflected back. That was when I noticed him. At the central table close to my father sat Dr. Samuel Reed. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't leaning in. He was watching. He had been my supervising physician for 3 years, a man who rarely wasted words. He saw everything in the trauma bay, the hesitation in a nurse's hand, the shift in a monitor tone before anyone else noticed. Our eyes met across the room. There was a flicker of recognition, then something else. Surprise, confusion. He glanced at the seating arrangement in front of him, then back at me, then toward my father. His posture changed subtly, straightened, alert. For the first time that evening, I felt something move beneath the surface of the room, not loud, not visible, just a shift. And I realized I wasn't the only one who understood exactly where I had been placed. I wasn't the only one who understood where I had been placed. The band finished their set, and the low hum of conversation settled into something expectant. My father stepped toward the center of the room, and someone handed him a microphone. The sound system clicked once, then steadied. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, leaving a warmer spotlight around him. He cleared his throat the way he always did before addressing a room. He began with gratitude. 30 years of marriage, commitment, Hard work. He spoke about building something that lasted, about foundations that don't crack under pressure. His voice carried easily practiced and smooth. Family, he said, is built on traditional values. There were nods around the room. He talked about loyalty, about discipline, about making choices that protect the family name rather than weaken it. He used words like integrity and sacrifice, words that sounded solid when placed side by side. From where I sat near the swinging kitchen doors, I watched the back of his jacket pull slightly across his shoulders as he gestured. I knew that posture. I had seen it at fundraisers, church events, company milestones. I assumed he would leave it there. I assumed I would remain unnamed. For a moment, I let myself believe the humiliation had already peaked when we were seated near the corridor. Then he paused. It was subtle, a small shift in his stance. His gaze moved across the room past the VIP table, past the polished silver and folded napkins. And it stopped on me. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives before something lands. I felt it in my throat. Not every child, he said slowly, grows up to make their parents proud. The words didn't rise. They didn't fall. They simply existed in the air between us. A few people chuckled, unsure. Then more joined in the laughter, thin and polite like glass tapped with a spoon. I kept my face still. Owen's fingers tightened around mine under the table. His small hand was warm. I could feel the pulse in his wrist fast. My father continued. We all have expectations, he said, and sometimes those expectations aren't met. The laughter swelled again, more confident now. Some guests glanced in my direction, not openly, but enough. I stared at the linen in front of me, at the faint crease running down its center. Then my mother stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on my father's arm. She leaned toward the microphone, her smile fixed and serene. But at least, she said gently, we still love her. Even when she makes unfortunate choices. The word hung there. Unfortunate. A spotlight shifted. I didn't realize it at first, only that the warmth on my face had intensified. Then I saw the beam of light angled directly toward our table, toward me, toward my son. The rest of the room dimmed slightly by comparison. I could see silhouettes turning in their chairs. I could hear the faint clink of someone setting down a glass. Owen looked up at me, confusion clouding his face. He didn't fully understand the words, but he understood tone. Children always do. Mom, he whispered. I felt the weight of every eye in that ballroom. Not hostile, not even cruel. Just curious. Measuring. I didn't lower my head. I didn't flinch. But inside, something cold settled into place. The laughter faded into scattered coughs and shifting fabric. My father lifted his glass, signaling the end of his remark, as if it had all been lighthearted, harmless. The spotlight remained on us a moment longer than it needed to. And in that brightness, I understood clearly this was not a slip. It was intentional. It was part of the program. It was part of the program. My father did not step away from the microphone. He adjusted his grip on it as if settling into something he had prepared. If we're being honest, he continued, voice steady discipline is what shapes a future. Without it, you become a cautionary tale. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. I've always believed he went on that accountability matters. That rebellion has consequences. And sometimes those consequences become visible. There was a pause. Just long enough. A living example of what happens when discipline is abandoned. The phrase landed heavier than the earlier joke. This time, the laughter was sharper. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. A ripple of amusement that rolled toward the back of the room and reached our table like a slow tide. I could hear it clearly. The low murmur behind me. Someone whispering, "Is that her?" Another voice answering, "That must be the daughter." I kept my gaze forward. My fingers pressed into the edge of the table until I felt the faint bite of the wood beneath the linen. And when a child grows up without structure, my father added, they make impulsive decisions. They bring children into the world without fathers. They expect the world to adjust around their mistakes. A few glasses clinked in agreement. Owen shifted in his seat. I felt him turning toward me before he spoke. "Mom," he asked quietly, barely louder than his own breathing, did I do something wrong? The room did not hear him, but I did. His voice wasn't confused. It was careful. As if he was asking a question he was afraid might have an answer he didn't want. Something inside my chest tightened so abruptly I thought I might lose my breath. The air felt thin, too bright. "No," I said, my voice steady in a way I didn't feel. "You didn't do anything wrong?" But he kept looking at me, searching my face for certainty. Up at the front of the room, my father lowered the microphone slightly as if he had made his point. I thought briefly that it was over. Then my mother stepped forward again. She rested her manicured hand lightly against my father's arm and leaned into the microphone with that same composed smile. "And of course," she said, tone soft, almost sympathetic, "we pray for her. And for the little one." She didn't look at us. "Every child deserves a proper family," she continued. "A real foundation. A father who stays. A home built the right way." A few guests nodded. One woman murmured, "That's true." My mother tilted her head slightly, voice dipping just enough to suggest concern. "Some children," she said, "deserve the chance to grow up in a family that reflects true values." The implication hung there, unmistakable. Owen's fingers tightened around mine again. I could feel the tremor in them now. I stood up. The chair legs scraped against the floor louder than I expected. A few heads turned. I didn't look at the stage. I didn't look at the VIP table. I didn't look at my parents. I reached for Owen's small jacket draped over the back of his chair and slid it gently over his shoulders. My hands were steady, almost mechanical. The humiliation wasn't what broke me. It was the idea that my son might grow up believing he was something that needed to be corrected. I placed my hand on his back and guided him toward the aisle between tables. The spotlight shifted slightly as we moved, then flickered back toward the front. I took one step. And that was when I heard another chair scrape across marble. Another chair scraped across marble. I didn't turn around yet. Owen's head was lowered now. His chin almost touched his chest, as if he could fold himself small enough to disappear. His eyes were wet, not with loud tears, just that thin shine that gathers when a child is trying not to cry in front of adults. His shoulders looked narrower in that suit. Too narrow. I had always believed I could shield him from whispers, from sideways glances at school forms where father remained blank, from the subtle questions that adults ask when they think children don't notice. I thought if I worked hard enough, loved fiercely enough, stood firm enough, it would be enough. But I couldn't shield him from this, not from his own grandparents. That realization didn't come like a sharp blow. It settled slowly, heavy, final. I lifted my eyes just once, scanning the room. I searched for something, anything that might soften what had just happened. A frown of disapproval, a shake of the head, a pair of eyes that said, "This is wrong." I found none. Most guests were looking down at their glasses, adjusting napkins, pretending to check their phones. A few still wore polite smiles, the kind people keep on when they don't want to disturb the atmosphere. Discomfort wrapped in courtesy. At the front of the room, my father had already resumed conversation with a man in a gray suit. I watched him lean in, slightly nodding as if they were discussing quarterly projections. His laugh rose, briefly controlled and low, as if nothing had happened. As if his grandson had not just asked his mother whether he was a mistake. My mother stood beside him, smoothing her dress, accepting compliments on the speech. Someone touched her arm and said something that made her tilt her head sympathetically. She looked composed. Proud even. I felt something inside me split into two distinct currents. One was anger. Not loud, not explosive. Just steady heat moving through my chest. Years of being reduced to a lesson, a warning, a footnote to someone else's story. The other was something colder. A numbness that spread outward, quieting everything it touched. I realized then that I had been waiting my entire adult life for them to choose differently, to soften, to claim us. I had mistaken tolerance for love, silence for acceptance. Owen's fingers curled into the fabric of my dress near my hip. "Mom," he said again, barely audible. "I'm here," I answered. I wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but I said it. I looked at my father one last time, not with hope, not with expectation, just observation. He did not look back. In that moment, something became clear in a way it never had before. This was not a misunderstanding. Not a bad joke that went too far. Not a lapse in judgment. This was who they were willing to be in front of a room full of people. And if I stayed, I would be agreeing to it. The thought was quiet, but it was decisive. I adjusted Owen's jacket again, smoothing the collar. My hands no longer trembled. The anger had cooled into something steadier, more precise. I leaned down so my mouth was near his ear. "We're leaving," I said softly. He nodded without looking up. As I turned toward the aisle, I understood what it would cost. Walking out wouldn't just mean leaving a party. It would mean closing a door I had kept cracked open for years. It would mean no more invitations, no more half-hearted holidays, no more waiting for recognition that was never coming. For a brief second I hesitated. Then I took the next step forward, fully prepared to sever whatever remained between us. And that was when the second chair scraped louder than the first. The second chair scraped louder than the first. This time, I turned. Dr. Samuel Reed was already standing. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He simply placed both hands on the table in front of him, pushed his chair back, and stepped into the open space between the VIP table and the center aisle. The movement was deliberate, controlled, the same way he moved in a trauma room when something wasn't right. My father noticed him immediately. I saw the flicker in his eyes. A calculation. Dr. Reed walked forward, his shoes quiet against the marble floor. The room adjusted around him. Conversations thinned. A few guests leaned back in their chairs to clear a path. He stopped a few feet from my parents. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand toward the microphone. His tone wasn't confrontational. It was measured. Professional. There was a brief hesitation. My father glanced at the room, at the guests, at the weight of who Dr. Reed was in that space. Then he handed it over. The microphone changed hands. Dr. Reed faced the audience first, not me. "I've had the privilege," he began, voice even and clear, "of working with your daughter for the past 3 years. A ripple moved through the room. I felt it. "In the emergency department," he continued. "Privilege is not a word we use lightly." He didn't look at me yet. "I have seen her step into trauma bays at 2 in the morning when most people are asleep. I have watched her hold pressure on wounds while waiting for surgeons. I have seen her stay past the end of her shift because a family needed someone steady in the room." The ballroom was silent now. The jazz band stood still in the corner. "I have watched her take responsibility for patients that weren't technically assigned to her because she noticed something others missed." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "There are nights," he said, "when we measure character in minutes, in decisions made without applause, without recognition." Only then did he turn slightly enough that I could see the side of his face. "If this," he said calmly, "is what you consider failure." He let the sentence hang. "Then I would welcome more failures like her in my hospital." The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They fell heavy. I felt Owen's grip tighten again, but this time it was different. Not fear. Something else. Dr. Reed continued. "In fact," he said, "I was planning to make this announcement privately next week. But perhaps context matters." A few heads shifted. I am formally recommending her for lead shift coordinator in our department. The title seemed to echo longer than it should have. She has earned it. Through consistency, through restraint, through skill. The air in the room felt different now. Thicker. Charged. Dr. Reed turned fully toward my father. Their eyes met. You may choose to be embarrassed, he said evenly. That is your decision. A pause. I am not. No one laughed. No one moved. The chandelier light seemed harsher now, illuminating faces that no longer wore polite smiles. I could see discomfort, surprise, a few expressions that bordered on shame. My father's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened, his hand still holding his champagne glass lowered slightly. My mother looked at the floor. Dr. Reed lowered the microphone slowly and placed it back into my father's hand. Then he stepped back. The room did not recover immediately. It sat in the silence. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer the only one standing. For the first time that evening, I was no longer the only one standing. The silence after Dr. Reed stepped back was not awkward. It was dense, like the air just before a storm splits open the sky. I thought that would be the end of it, that the damage had already been done in both directions, that the room would slowly recover, glasses would lift again, and everyone would pretend this had been an unusual but contained moment. Then another chair moved, not from the front, from the back of the room. Angela Carter stood near the last row of tables beside the service corridor where we had been seated. I hadn't noticed her when we arrived. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, a slim notebook tucked beneath her arm. I knew her from college. She had been the one who asked professors the uncomfortable questions. She didn't walk toward the stage. She simply raised her voice enough to carry. Since we're discussing character, she said evenly, perhaps transparency matters too. The room shifted again. My father's eyes found her immediately. Recognition flickered there. Not warmth. Calculation. Angela stepped forward into the light spilling from the chandeliers. For the past 6 months, she continued, I've been investigating regional construction firms using undocumented labor and falsified subcontractor records. Her tone was factual, not dramatic. A formal report is being finalized. I felt Owen's fingers tighten around mine. And Mitchell and Sons Construction, she said clearly, is among the companies currently under review. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. It was the kind of statement that didn't require volume to land. The atmosphere in the room tilted. I could almost feel it physically, the subtle withdrawal of confidence, the quick glances between men who had been laughing minutes earlier. One of my father's partners set his glass down carefully, as if it were suddenly fragile. Angela didn't raise her voice. Documents have already been submitted, she added. Public records requests are pending. A chair scraped again. This time not in defiance, but retreat. One of the men in gray murmured something about an early flight. Another followed. A third reached for his coat without making eye contact. The exodus wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Strategic. My mother stepped forward abruptly, her composure cracking at the edges. This is not the place, she began, voice tighter than I had ever heard it. Angela didn't argue. She didn't smile. She simply met her gaze. With respect, she said, public reputation is precisely the place. My father attempted to laugh. It came out hollow. He adjusted his tie, glanced around the room as if expecting someone to dismiss the claim as absurd. No one did. The confidence that had filled his posture earlier drained in increments. His shoulders lost their lift. His smile failed to return. The chandeliers hadn't changed, but the room felt dimmer. I stood there, still holding Owen's hand, watching the architecture of certainty collapse in slow motion. I did not feel triumph, only clarity. The narrative that had been built around me, the cautionary tale, the failure, no longer stood uncontested. But I understood something else too. This room was about to fracture in ways that would grow loud, defensive, ugly. I didn't need Owen to witness that. I squeezed his hand gently. "Come on," I said. We moved toward the exit while conversations began rising in uneven waves behind us. My mother's voice sharpened. My father's grew strained. The doors to the ballroom opened, releasing us into the cooler air of the hallway. The noise behind us swelled, then blurred as the doors closed again. Outside, the night felt still. Owen looked up at me. I didn't look back at the building. We walked toward the parking lot before everything inside finally exploded. We didn't hear the explosion, but we felt the aftermath. By the time I drove us home that night, my phone had already begun to vibrate in the cup holder. I didn't look at it. The road ahead was dark and steady, and Owen had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, his head tilted slightly toward the window. It wasn't until the next morning, standing in my kitchen with coffee, cooling untouched on the counter, that I opened the notifications. Someone had recorded Dr. Reed's speech. Not the entire evening, not my father's remarks. Just the part where he stood up, where he spoke my name without shame. The video had already been shared dozens of times. By noon, hundreds. The caption varied depending on who posted it. ER worker, defended by hospital director after family humiliation. Doctor calls out, toxic parenting at public event. I watched it once. The camera angle was uneven, filmed from somewhere near the center tables. You could hear the clink of glassware in the background. You could hear my father's breath in the microphone when he first handed it over. What struck me wasn't the applause, because there wasn't any. It was the stillness. The way the room held itself differently once the words were spoken. By Monday, the hospital administration had called me in. Not privately, formally. The position Dr. Reed mentioned that night, lead shift coordinator, was confirmed 2 days later. It came with longer hours, more responsibility, a salary adjustment that would allow me to stop calculating grocery totals in the aisle. When they handed me the letter, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt earned. 3 weeks after the party, Angela's article was published. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sensational. It was precise. Records, statements, interviews, documentation of subcontractors paid off the books. Discrepancies in reported labor hours. Mitchell and Sons Construction was named clearly in the third paragraph. The audit began within days. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need to. The silence from my parents told me enough. Then one evening my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Old reflex. Self-protection. Instead I answered. His voice was different. Not softer. Just stripped of its usual certainty. "I didn't expect it to go this far," he said. There was no accusation in it. No lecture. Just fatigue. I didn't rush to fill the space. I didn't offer comfort. "I'm not calling to argue," he added after a moment. For the first time in my life, he sounded unsure of what role he occupied in the conversation. I did not apologize. I did not raise my voice. "I won't discuss the investigation," I said calmly, "and I won't apologize for existing." There was a long pause. "I know," he said quietly. We ended the call without resolution, without reconciliation, but also without performance. Life did not transform overnight. There were still bills, still night shifts, still mornings where exhaustion settled deep in my shoulders. But something fundamental had shifted. At school, Owen began telling his friends that his mom saves people. He said it plainly, without hesitation. One afternoon, I overheard him explain that when someone can't breathe or is bleeding, my mom is there. He didn't mention grandparents, or parties, or microphones. Just that. And when I heard him say it, I realized the narrative that mattered most had never belonged to the ballroom. It belonged to him. The narrative that mattered most had never belonged to the ballroom. It belonged to him. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, I began to understand something I had resisted for years. Honor does not come from the family you were born into. It comes from the choices you make when no one is applauding. I used to measure myself against their silence, against the way my name sounded in my father's mouth, tight, restrained, slightly disappointed. I used to wait for a different tone, a public acknowledgement, a simple introduction without qualification. I don't wait anymore. There is a quiet that comes with that decision. Not bitterness, not relief, just the absence of striving. Every morning now, when I walk through the hospital doors badge clipped to my scrubs, I feel the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders. It is not light. It is not glamorous. But it is real. The fluorescent lights hum. The scent of antiseptic rises the same way it always has. Monitors beep in steady intervals. Patients arrive without warning. Some leave walking. Some don't. I step into each shift with my head upright. Not because anyone defended me in a ballroom, but because I know exactly what I bring into that room. Owen no longer asks if he did something wrong. That question hasn't crossed his lips since the night of the party. Instead, he asks different things now. Did the baby make it? Were you scared? Do people say thank you? His questions are about courage, about effort, about outcome. They are not about shame. Sometimes when I tuck him into bed, he presses his small palm against my cheek and says, "You're strong, Mom." He says it like it's a fact, not a consolation. I used to think strength meant enduring humiliation without breaking, staying seated, keeping my face composed while the room laughed. Now I understand it differently. Strength was walking out. Strength was answering the phone without lowering my voice. Strength is standing in a trauma bay at 2 in the morning and choosing to stay steady for someone else's worst moment. I have stopped introducing myself in ways that soften the truth. I am not a cautionary tale. I am not a lesson in discipline. I am not the living example of what happens when someone chooses differently. I am a woman who chose her child and continues to choose him every day. There is something else I've come to believe. A real family is not defined by blood or shared last names. It is defined by who stands beside you when the room turns its back. Who speaks when silence would be easier? Who holds your hand without calculating the cost? Sometimes that family is small. Sometimes it is just two people walking out into a parking lot together while a building behind them begins to fracture. For the first time in my life, I no longer feel like the daughter who embarrassed someone. I do not carry that role with me anymore. I am not an apology waiting to happen. I am not unfinished. I am a mother, and that is enough.